In the Tower of London, beneath the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, lies the unmarked grave of a girl who was once Queen of England. Her name was Catherine Howard, and when she died on February 13th, 1542, she was barely 19 years old, possibly even younger. She had been queen for just 18 months. Her husband, King Henry VIII, called her his rose without a thorn and showered her with jewels, gowns, and public affection. Spoiler alert, she definitely had thorns. And Henry never attended her execution. He couldn't bear to watch. This is the story of Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII. And yes, if you're keeping count, we're well past the fool me once, shame on you stage of Henry's marital career. This is a story of a neglected child thrust into the most dangerous court in Europe. A young woman caught between powerful families who used her as a pawn, and ultimately, a teenager who paid the ultimate price for choices she may never have been free to make. This is her story. To understand Catherine Howard, we must first understand the world she was born into. The Howards were one of England's oldest and most powerful noble families. They had survived the Wars of the Roses by employing what we might call aggressive flexibility, switching sides when necessary, always managing to land on their feet. Think Political Survivors, Tudor edition. Catherine's uncle, Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, was one of the most powerful men at Henry VIII's court. He had military prowess, political cunning, and an absolute determination to keep his family in the king's favour. The Howards had already given one niece to the king, Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and that had ended with her head in a basket in 1536. Now, any reasonable family might have looked at that outcome and thought, you know what, maybe we should steer clear of royal marriages for a generation or two. But not the Howards. They saw Anne's execution as a minor setback, not a sign to change strategy. But Catherine's father, Lord Edmund Howard, was the youngest of the Duke of Norfolk's many brothers, and being a youngest son in Tudor England meant poverty, despite your famous name. It's like being a Kardashian without the money. You've got the name recognition, but you're still eating ramen. Edmund had no inheritance, no estate, no income to speak of. He once wrote to Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, saying he wished he'd been born a poor man's son, because at least then he could work without shame. That's right. This nobleman was so broke, he was nostalgic for a hypothetical life as a peasant. Catherine was born around 1523 or 1524. No one bothered to record the exact date, which tells you everything about her importance at the time. She was one of perhaps 10 or 11 children, though even that number is uncertain because, again, no one was keeping careful records. Another Howard baby, just add it to the pile. Her mother, Joyce Culpepper, had been married before and brought 5 children from her first marriage. With Edmund, she had several more. Catherine was probably the 10th child, one more mouth in an already overcrowded, impoverished household. The family moved constantly, always one step ahead of creditors. Young Catherine would have known hunger, cold, and the particular shame that comes from bearing a famous name while wearing hand-me-down clothes. When Catherine was very young, perhaps 5 or 6, her mother died. The historical record doesn't tell us much about Joyce Culpepper, but her death left Catherine and her siblings even more vulnerable. Edmund Howard, overwhelmed and penniless, did what many Tudor parents did with children they couldn't afford to keep. He sent them away. Catherine was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Chesworth House in Sussex, and later at Norfolk House in Lambeth. On the surface, this seemed like good fortune. The Duchess's household was large and prestigious, filled with the sons and daughters of noble families who needed education and refinement. It was basically Tudor finishing school. But here's where things get interesting. Agnes Tilney, though powerful and connected, was often absent at court, and the household she left behind was shockingly unsupervised. We're talking parents out of town for the weekend levels of chaos, except it lasted for years. At Norfolk House, young noble women and men lived in a dormitory setting with minimal supervision. The Maiden's chamber, where Catherine and other girls slept, became basically the first season of a reality TV show. Bored teenagers and young adults and minimal supervision. What could possibly go wrong? Catherine arrived at this household around 1531 or 1532, when she was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. She was a child, neglected, hungry for affection, and surrounded by older teenagers and young adults who were likewise bored and left to their own devices. It was not an ideal situation. By the time Catherine was 13 or 14, she caught the attention of Henry VIII, a music teacher employed at the household. Mannix was in a position of authority over Catherine, and what began as music lessons became something more. But the relationship with Mannix wasn't the only entanglement in Catherine's youth. Frances Derham, the Duchess's secretary, also became involved with the teenage Catherine. Derham was older, charming, and ambitious. He called Catherine his wife. They may have been formally engaged in a pre-contract of marriage, which in Tudor England could be as binding as marriage itself. According to later testimony, Derham and Catherine were intimate. They had secret meetings, exchanged tokens of affection, and Derham allegedly called her wife. Some of the other young women in the household later testified, with what we can only imagine was considerable awkwardness, that they had seen Derham and Catherine together in compromising positions. Now, the Victorian historians who wrote about this loved to paint Catherine as a wanton teenage seductress. But here's the crucial question that haunts Catherine Howard's story. How much of this was Catherine's choice? She was a teenager, possibly as young as 14 or 15. Derham was an adult man in a position of power. The historian Josephine Wilkinson has suggested that neither the relationship with Mannix nor with Derham was truly consensual, and many modern scholars agree. Catherine was a girl desperate for love and attention, surrounded by men who took advantage of her vulnerability. The Maiden's chamber at Norfolk House wasn't a den of teenage sin. It was a safeguarding disaster. In 1539, Catherine's father Edmund died. She was an orphan now, still living in her step-grandmother's chaotic household. But her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had plans. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves was arranged in late 1539 and celebrated in January 1540. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Henry took one look at Anne and basically said, "This is not what was advertised." The marriage was never consummated, which Henry had no problem announcing to anyone who would listen. Privacy was not a Tudor virtue. The Howards, ever alert to opportunity, saw their chance. Remember, they'd already given one niece to Henry, and she'd been executed. Most families would see this as a red flag. The Howards saw it as a business model. Catherine was brought to court as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves. Suddenly, this poor relation who had grown up in chaos was living at the most glittering, dangerous court in Europe. It was like going from community college directly to Shark Tank. Catherine Howard was not considered a great beauty by Tudor standards. She was petite, had reddish-brown hair and a pleasant face. But she had something more compelling: vivacity, charm, and what contemporaries called superlative grace. She knew how to flirt, how to laugh, how to make people feel special when she paid them attention. In modern terms, she had charisma. Henry VIII noticed her immediately, which was not necessarily good news. But who was the king who fell so desperately in love with Catherine Howard? Henry VIII in 1540 was not the golden prince of his youth. That ship had sailed, gained weight, and developed serious medical issues. He was 49 years old, massively overweight, and suffering from a leg ulcer that would never heal, the result of a jousting accident years earlier. The ulcer caused Henry constant pain and produced such a terrible smell that courtiers could barely stand near him. Imagine being so powerful that people have to pretend not to notice you smell like a medieval hospital. That was Henry's life. He was increasingly paranoid, quick to anger, and absolutely convinced that his young wife Anne of Cleves had deceived him about her appearance, which was rich, coming from a man whose own portraits were heavily airbrushed by court artists. Henry was also obsessed with having more sons. His only legitimate son, Prince Edward, was a sickly child. His daughter Mary was in her 20s and considered illegitimate. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was just 6 years old and also legally a bastard. Henry's succession planning was, to put it mildly, a mess. When Henry looked at Catherine Howard, he didn't see a teenager from an impoverished family with a complicated past. He saw youth, fertility, and a chance to feel young again. He called her his rose without a thorn, implying that, unlike Anne of Cleves, and perhaps his other wives, Catherine was perfect, uncomplicated, and pure. Henry, buddy, maybe get to know her first? The courtship was remarkably brief. By spring 1540, Henry was showering Catherine with gifts, jewels, gowns, land. The Howards encouraged the match shamelessly. This was their chance to regain the power they'd lost when Anne Boleyn was executed. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, suddenly found himself in a precarious position. The king needed a way out of his marriage, and someone had to take the blame. Cromwell had made enemies, lots of them, and now they smelled blood in the water. On July 9, 1540, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation. Anne, proving herself to be the smartest person in this entire story, agreed without protest. No drama, no argument, just, "Sure, Henry, whatever you say." She was given estates, income, and the title of the King's beloved sister. Essentially, Anne got a generous divorce settlement and got to keep her head. In the game of Tudor marriages, Anne of Cleves was the only player who actually won. She would outlive all of Henry's other wives, attend court parties, and generally have a grand time. Anne of Cleves, the one who got away. On July 28, 1540, just 19 days after the annulment, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. That same day, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. The Howards had won, and the Howards being the Howards, they were not gracious in victory. On August 8, 1540, Catherine Howard was publicly acknowledged as Queen of England. She was somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. Henry was 49. For the first months, the marriage seemed happy. Henry was absolutely besotted with his young bride. He gave her jewels that had belonged to his previous wives, because nothing says "I love you" like hand-me-down jewellery from your executed and divorced predecessors. He gave her fine horses, expensive gowns, estates. Henry couldn't keep his hands off Catherine in public. Courtiers noted his constant touching, kissing and fondling, with a mixture of amusement and profound discomfort. These were people who had seen a lot at court, and even they were like, "Okay, Henry, we get it. Maybe tone it down." Catherine, to her credit, played the role of queen with more grace than many expected. At her first Christmas as queen, she welcomed Anne of Cleves warmly. The two women exchanged gifts and even danced together, which must have been deeply weird for everyone involved. Catherine successfully interceded with Henry to pardon some prisoners, following the tradition of royal mercy. She promoted her family members to positions at court and generally behaved as a conventional Tudor queen should. But there were warning signs. Catherine appointed many of her old friends from the Duchess's household to serve her as queen, including women who knew about her past relationships, which from a career management perspective was perhaps not the shrewdest move. She also fatally gave Francis Derham a position as her private secretary. You might be asking, why would Catherine appoint Derham of all people to such a sensitive position? The most likely answer: blackmail. Derham appeared at court basically strutting around, boasting of his former relationship with the Queen, hinting that he had special knowledge. Catherine may have felt she had no choice but to give him a position to keep him quiet. "Sure, Francis, you can work in my household. Please don't tell anyone about that thing. You know, the thing." It was a disaster waiting to happen. But there was an even more dangerous situation developing. Catherine had caught the attention of Thomas Culpepper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. Culpepper was young, handsome, and charming. Everything Henry was not. And crucially, Culpepper was the King's favourite. Henry trusted him completely. Culpepper attended to Henry's most intimate needs, including dressing his leg ulcer. So naturally, Catherine fell for him. Because in the hierarchy of bad decisions, falling for your elderly husband's favourite servant while you're Queen of England ranks pretty high. The historical record becomes murky here. We know that Catherine sent gifts to Culpepper. We know they had private meetings arranged by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother George, who served as one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Lady Rochford, it should be noted, had been implicated in her own husband's execution. She testified against him when he was accused of sleeping with his sister, Anne Boleyn. Now she was facilitating secret meetings for another Howard queen. Lady Rochford's decision-making skills were questionable. What we don't know for certain is what happened in those meetings. Both Catherine and Culpepper later swore under interrogation that no intimate relationship occurred. But the meetings themselves, a queen alone with a gentleman of the king's household, were scandalous enough to be considered treason. Some historians believe Catherine genuinely fell in love with Culpepper. Others suggest she was manipulated or coerced. We'll never know the full truth. What we do know is that Catherine was a teenager, trapped in marriage to an increasingly unstable and physically repulsive older man, and that Culpepper represented everything she couldn't have: youth, romance, and perhaps genuine affection. It was a recipe for disaster. In the summer of 1541, Henry decided to take Catherine on a royal progress to the north of England. This wasn't just a pleasure trip, it was a political necessity. The north had been restive since the Pilgrimage of Grace, a major rebellion in 1536 that had nearly toppled Henry's government. The royal progress was massive. Hundreds of courtiers, servants, wagons of belongings, portable furniture, even portable kitchens. When Henry travelled, he didn't exactly pack light. It was less road trip and more mobile palace. Catherine was expected to display queenly magnificence at every stop, to show the northern nobles that their king was powerful, wealthy, and secure. No pressure. Thomas Culpepper travelled with the king's household. So did Francis Derham as part of Catherine's retinue. This was basically a romantic disaster on wheels. During the progress, Catherine's reckless behaviour reached new heights. Despite the constant presence of courtiers and servants, and remember, this is a time when privacy barely existed, especially for royalty, Catherine arranged secret meetings with Culpepper. Lady Rochford acted as go-between and lookout. At several stops along the way, including Pontefract Castle and Lincoln, Culpepper was smuggled up backstairs to Catherine's chambers late at night. The meetings sometimes lasted until 2 or 3 in the morning. Now, in a modern TV drama, this would be thrilling. Secret romance, forbidden love. In reality, it was monumentally stupid. Servants noticed. Courtiers whispered. The logistics alone were absurd. You're trying to conduct a secret affair while travelling with hundreds of people, including your husband's entire court. It's like trying to have a private conversation in the middle of Times Square. But no one dared tell the king. Henry was in a good mood, enjoying his young wife, feeling virile and powerful again. Who wanted to be the one to tell him he was being made a fool? Why did Catherine take such enormous risks? Perhaps she was genuinely in love. Perhaps she felt trapped and desperate. Perhaps she was simply too young and too reckless to understand the consequences of her actions. Or perhaps, and this is a distinct possibility, she was being manipulated by people around her, including Lady Rochford, who may have had her own agenda. Some historians speculate that Rochford, having survived the execution of her husband and sister-in-law, may have been deliberately sabotaging another Howard queen. That's dark, but not impossible. What we know from later testimony is that these meetings happened, that they were inappropriate, and that they gave Catherine's enemies all the ammunition they needed to destroy her. While Catherine was conducting her dangerous liaisons in the north, her enemies at court were gathering evidence. The Howards had made many enemies during their rise to power. Protestant reformers hated them for their Catholic sympathies. Other noble families resented their influence over the king. And there were still people around who remembered Anne Boleyn and weren't thrilled about another Howard queen. One of Catherine's former companions from the Duchess's household, Mary Lascelles, told her brother John, a Protestant reformer, about Catherine's youthful relationships with Manox and Dereham. John Lascelles saw an opportunity. He could bring down the Catholic Howards and their young queen in one move. It was too good to pass up. He took the information to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, one of the leading Protestant reformers and a long-time enemy of the Howard family. And that's when everything fell apart. On November 1st, 1541, All Saints' Day, the royal progress returned to Hampton Court Palace. Henry was in high spirits, pleased with the success of the journey, and still infatuated with his young wife. He had no idea what was coming. That evening, while Henry was at Mass, because nothing ruins a holy day like devastating news, Archbishop Cranmer approached him with a letter. The letter detailed Catherine's premarital relationships with Manox and Dereham. Cranmer, who had seen Henry's rage before and valued his own head, was terrified of delivering this news. He simply handed Henry the letter and quickly walked away. "Here you go, Your Majesty. I'll just be over there, far away." Henry's initial reaction was disbelief. His rose without a thorn had deceived him. Impossible! This must be lies, spread by enemies of the Howards. Catherine was young, pure, innocent. He ordered an immediate investigation, expecting, perhaps, that it would clear Catherine's name, and he could execute whoever had spread these vicious rumours. But the investigation did the opposite. With every interrogation, the situation got worse. Within days, Manox, Derham, and several women from the Duchess's household were arrested and interrogated. Under threat of torture, which, let's be honest, was a very effective interrogation technique in Tudor England, they told everything. The unsupervised Maiden's chamber, the inappropriate relationships, the gifts and secret meetings, the fact that Derham had called Catherine his wife, the time they were caught together in compromising positions, it all came spilling out. Catherine herself was questioned. She was kept under guard at Hampton Court, forbidden to see the king. Initially, she denied everything, but as the evidence mounted, and as the very real threat of execution became clear, she began to break. Now here's the thing. Catherine's relationship with Derham before her marriage, while scandalous, wasn't technically illegal. Inappropriate, yes. Grounds for divorce, absolutely, but not necessarily grounds for execution. Many historians believe that if Catherine had stopped there, if there had been no relationship with Culpepper during her marriage, she might have survived. Henry might have divorced her, sent her away to a convent, declared the marriage invalid, but not executed her. But then the investigation turned to Thomas Culpepper, and that's when Catherine's fate was sealed. Under interrogation, Lady Rochford admitted that she had facilitated meetings between Catherine and Culpepper during the royal progress. She provided details, the times, the places, how Culpepper had been smuggled into the Queen's chambers via back staircases at 2 a.m. Culpepper was arrested and interrogated. He admitted to the meetings, but swore that nothing intimate had occurred. They had just talked, for hours, in the middle of the night, alone in the Queen's chambers. Sure, Thomas, that's believable. Catherine, when confronted with this evidence, said the same thing. Yes, she had met with Culpepper privately, but they had not committed adultery. Did Henry believe them? It didn't matter. Under Tudor law, even the intent to commit adultery with the Queen was treason, punishable by death. A queen meeting privately with a gentleman of the king's household was treasonous, regardless of whether sexual intercourse occurred. And there was a deeper wound here. Henry had trusted Culpepper completely. This was the man who dressed his ulcerous leg, who attended to his most intimate needs, who saw Henry at his most vulnerable. And Culpepper had betrayed him, or so Henry believed, with his own wife. Henry's reaction was volcanic. He wept. He raged. He called for a sword, saying he would kill Catherine himself. His counsellors had to physically restrain him and talk him down. It was not a good look for the supreme head of the Church of England. For several days, Henry refused to believe the full extent of Catherine's betrayal. He oscillated between fury and heartbreak. At one point, he left Hampton Court and simply disappeared. His counsellors didn't know where he was for hours. He was eventually found at a hunting lodge, alone, weeping. The great Henry VIII, who had broken with Rome and established himself as head of the church, who had executed 2 wives and countless nobles, was crying over a teenage girl who had made him feel young again. But grief soon turned to cold fury. Henry wasn't a man who stayed sad for long. Anger was much more his style. On December 1st, 1541, Culpepper and Derham were tried and convicted of treason. They were sentenced to the full horror of a traitor's death, to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Which, if you don't know the details of that execution method, Google it at your own risk. It was designed to be as painful and drawn out as possible. On December 10th, they were executed at Tyburn. Culpepper, because he was the king's favourite, or had been anyway, was granted the mercy of simple beheading. 1 swing of the axe, and it was over. Derham was not so lucky. He suffered the full, agonizing death, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down, castrated, disemboweled while still conscious, and finally beheaded. His quarters were displayed around London as a warning. Tudor justice was not known for its subtlety. Henry still wouldn't see Catherine. She was moved from Hampton Court to Sion Abbey, a former religious house where she was kept under guard. She was no longer addressed as Queen, just as Catherine Howard. All her jewels, her fine clothes, her belongings were taken away. She went from Queen to prisoner overnight. Henry wanted Catherine executed, but there was a legal problem. She hadn't been tried. There had been no formal accusation in court, no chance for her to defend herself, no trial by jury. Now, a less paranoid king might have just given her a trial. But Henry had learned from his experience with Anne Boleyn. Trials could be unpredictable. Juries might be sympathetic. Better to skip that whole messy process. So Henry had Parliament pass a Bill of Attainder, essentially a law declaring Catherine guilty without trial. It was legislative execution. Parliament simply voted that she was guilty, and that was that. The bill also contained a chilling provision for the future. From now on, it would be treason for any woman to marry the king, without first revealing any premarital sexual relationships. Henry was essentially legislating that all future wives had to disclose their sexual history or face execution. On February 11th, 1542, the bill passed. 2 days later, Catherine Howard would be dead. Catherine spent her last days at Sion Abbey in a state of near collapse. She was barely 19 years old, and she knew she was going to die. No reprieve was coming. Henry wouldn't see her. No one could help her. The historical record tells us that during these final days, Catherine asked for the execution block to be brought to her room. She wanted to practice laying her head on it, to ensure she would meet death with dignity. Let that sink in for a moment. A teenage girl, practicing how to die. This heartbreaking detail reveals both Catherine's terror and her determination to die bravely. In Tudor England, how you died mattered. A good death, calm, dignified, accepting, could redeem your reputation. Catherine wanted to get it right. Lady Rochford, who would be executed alongside Catherine for her role in facilitating the meetings with Culpepper, was in even worse condition. She had suffered a complete mental breakdown and was by all accounts barely lucid. She was raving, incoherent, possibly psychotic. There was even some question about whether it was legal to execute someone who was insane. Henry's response to this legal conundrum was characteristically straightforward. Parliament quickly passed another law, stating that insanity was no barrier to execution for treason. Problem solved. Tudor efficiency at its finest. On February 10, 1542, Catherine was taken by barge down the Thames to the Tower of London. She entered through the same watergate, later known as Traitor's Gate, that her cousin Anne Boleyn had entered 6 years before. Think about that journey. Down the Thames, watching London pass by, knowing you'll never see it again. Entering the Tower through the same gate as your executed cousin. Catherine knew exactly what awaited her. She was held in comfortable apartments. The Tower had royal lodgings for high-status prisoners, but she knew what awaited her. The execution was scheduled for the morning of February 13th. She had 1 day left to live. The scaffold was erected on Tower Green, the same private location where Anne Boleyn had been executed. This wasn't a public spectacle like most executions. Only select witnesses were allowed to attend, including members of the Howard family who had used Catherine so ruthlessly. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold. Despite her earlier practice with the block, she was clearly terrified. Witnesses reported that her hands trembled. Her voice shook. But she made her speech, the expected declaration that she deserved death for offending the king, and a plea that her family not be punished for her crimes. It was formulaic, required by custom, and heartbreaking coming from a teenage girl. Legend says her last words were, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpepper." It's a beautiful, tragic quote. The problem is, no eyewitness ever recorded Catherine saying it. But the fact that this legend exists, that for nearly 500 years people have wanted Catherine to have said those words, tells us something important. It tells us that even her contemporaries recognised the injustice of what was happening. They wanted her to have that one moment of defiance, that one declaration of what she truly felt. The speech she actually gave was a lie, of course. Catherine didn't deserve death. But in Tudor England, condemned prisoners were expected to praise the king's justice even as they were about to be executed for it. They had to protect their families, who would suffer if the condemned person's last words offended the king. It was one final indignity. Catherine knelt at the block. The executioner raised his axe. In one swift stroke it was over. Catherine Howard, fifth wife of Henry VIII, was dead. She was approximately 19 years old. Lady Rochford was executed immediately after, finally meeting the same fate as her husband George Boleyn, executed 6 years earlier for alleged adultery with Anne Boleyn. If there's an afterlife, that reunion was probably awkward. Both women's bodies were buried quickly, without ceremony, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. They were laid in unmarked graves near Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn. The chapel floor would eventually hold the remains of 3 of Henry VIII's wives and numerous other executed nobles. It was getting crowded in there. When the chapel was restored during Queen Victoria's reign in the 1870s, attempts were made to identify the bodies buried there. Anne Boleyn's remains were found and reburied with some ceremony. But Catherine Howard's body was never identified with certainty. She remains in an unmarked grave to this day. Henry VIII never attended Catherine's execution. Some say he was too heartbroken. Others suggest he was simply done with her, on to the next chapter of his life. Within months, Henry was courting Catherine Parr, who would become his 6th and final wife. Catherine Parr, notably, was a widow who was smart enough to outlive Henry. She said yes to his marriage proposal, but you have to imagine she was thinking, this is a terrible idea the entire time. Catherine Howard has been judged harshly by history. She's been called promiscuous, foolish, a silly girl who brought her fate upon herself. Victorian historians were particularly cruel, depicting her as a temptress who got what she deserved. But modern historians have begun to reassess Catherine's story with more compassion and nuance. They see a neglected child, a teenager who was used as a political pawn by her ambitious family, and a young woman who was, by any modern standard, groomed and exploited by older men. Let's review the timeline. Catherine was approximately 14 when Henry Manox began his inappropriate relationship with her. She was 15 or 16 with Francis Derham. She was 17 or 18 when she married a man old enough to be her grandfather, and she was 19 when she died. At every stage of her short life, Catherine was surrounded by adults who should have protected her, but instead used her for their own ends. Her uncle Norfolk used her to gain political power. Derham may have blackmailed her. Even Lady Rochford, who facilitated the meetings with Culpepper, may have had her own agenda. The Duchess of Norfolk, who should have supervised her household, was too busy at court to notice that her maiden's chamber had turned into a chaotic mess. Edmund Howard, Catherine's father, was too poor and overwhelmed to care for his daughter properly. The system failed her at every turn. Was Catherine reckless? Yes. Did she make terrible decisions? Absolutely. But she was also 19 years old, trapped in an impossible situation with no good options available to her. Today, visitors to the Tower of London can visit the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. On the west wall is a memorial plaque listing all those who died in the tower and are buried there. Catherine Howard's name is among them, alongside her cousin Anne Boleyn. There's also a legend, probably false but persistent, that Catherine's ghost haunts Hampton Court Palace, running through what's now called the Haunted Gallery, screaming for Henry to hear her pleas of innocence. It's a ghost story, nothing more. But perhaps it speaks to our collective guilt about how Catherine was treated, and our wish that somehow she had been able to make the king listen. That someone, anyone, had listened to her. Catherine Howard's story reminds us that history isn't just about kings and battles and political manoeuvres. It's also about human beings, often young, vulnerable people, who were caught up in forces beyond their control. Was Catherine guilty of treason under Tudor law? Probably, by the strict standards of the time. Her meetings with Culpepper were illegal, regardless of whether anything intimate occurred. Her failure to reveal her past relationships to Henry before their marriage could also be construed as treasonous deception. But was she justly treated? That's a very different question. Catherine never had a trial. She never had a chance to defend herself in open court. She was executed based on evidence gathered through interrogation and torture of others, and on a bill of attainder that simply declared her guilty by parliamentary decree. And perhaps most importantly, should a 19-year-old girl have died for the mistakes she made as a teenager? Should she have paid with her life for relationships that, by any modern understanding, were deeply inappropriate because of the power imbalances involved? History cannot undo what was done to Catherine Howard, but we can remember her with compassion, understanding that her story is far more complex than the simple narrative of a silly girl who brought about her own downfall. She was someone's daughter, someone's cousin, someone's friend. She was Queen of England for 18 months. And she died at 19 years old on a cold February morning in the Tower of London. May her memory be more than just a cautionary tale. May it be a reminder of the human cost of power, ambition, and the ruthless politics of the Tudor court. And may it remind us that behind every historical figure, even the ones we think we know, there's a real person whose story deserves to be told with honesty, nuance, and compassion. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for Catherine and all those throughout history whose stories were shaped by forces beyond their control. And meet us back here soon for our next venture into stories past. Sweet dreams.